Welcome to the Michael Simmons Show, where we help you create blockbuster content that changes the world and builds your business. We dive deep into the habits and hacks of today's top thought leaders. Now, here's the show.
Today, we have one of my close friends joining us, Spencer Greenberg. Spencer is one of the smartest people I know, and also one of the most caring people I know. He got an undergrad degree in math from Columbia University, and then got a PhD in math from NYU, where I went to school. And he has, after that, built a quantitative hedge fund company, and that was successful. And now is building apps which are focused on increasing the quality of life for people, from everything from depression to just thinking routines to make better decisions. And another thing about Spencer is I love that he's just a really elite learner, and he has a very unique approach to learning, which we're going to talk about. And he's one of the best question askers that I've seen. If you look on his Twitter, you'll see that he's constantly asking questions and predicting the responses. And so today we're going to really talk about one of the fundamental things of thought leadership, which is asking really high quality questions. And so much of being a thought leader stems from asking those questions. So without further ado, I give you Spencer Greenberg. All right, Spencer, welcome to the podcast. Really, really excited to have you here.
Michael, so glad to be here.
So I feel like when we talk, there's a million things we could talk about.
That's true.
But today I want to talk about a very specific thing that I think you have expertise in, that more than anyone else I know, and it's a really important area. And that area is questions. You create applications through Sparkwave to take people through sequences of questions to help with depression, to help be more creative, to make wiser decisions, to connect with others. You probably, on my feed, you do more questions via Twitter polls than anyone. And now with the podcast, you're actually asking questions. And so my first question for you is, can you tell me more of your story and history with questions and that got you to see them as so important?
I love it. It's a question. Yeah. So one way to think about questions is that you're giving a prompt to your subconscious, because generally speaking, when you get an answer back from a question, it just kind of pops into your mind what the answer is. And so if you think about your subconscious mind as sort of a database, questions are the way you query that database. And it's sort of like that. If you're, if you're learning to use Google well, you have to learn how do you make the right search queries, right? And similarly, to use your mind well, you have to learn to make the right search query. So that's kind of a reframe of questions are the theory of how to search your own mind for answers.
Let me ask you a question on there. I'm going to be jumping around. Sure, I want to go deeper, but it made me think about this. I've been going pretty deep on parts work. There's all these different disciplines like internal family systems, voice dialoguing, optimal conflict. There's probably I listed about 10 things where you ask yourself different. You're not just asking yourself a general question to your general subconscious. You are asking a specific part of yourself a question. Or sometimes Mark Andreessen has this idea of he has avatars of people, such as Peter Thiel on his shoulder. When he's solving a problem, he asks the question. How do you think about that when you're doing a question? Do you just do it to the general subconscious or to a part of your mind?
Yeah, great. That's a good question. I don't take those parts too literally. I think they're useful metaphors, or put into the framework that we've been talking about, search queries. They're metadata on the search query. It's like you're giving yourself a question in the style, and give me the answer in the style of Peter Thiel, right? Or
interesting.
Or you're asking yourself a question, but respond from the point of view of the child in myself that is scared and was hurt or whatever. So I think that's it's basically metadata that changes the way we respond. But I don't think that those parts are literal. I think that they're just ways of altering the way that we get a response.
Yeah, it's interesting though, because it could give us very different answers. It's not just
absolutely in
a different style. It's fundamentally, it could even be opposing answers.
Right. Well, essentially, what I think is going on there is you're getting your mind to simulate something. So you're getting your mind to simulate Peter Thiel. So you have a little mental model of Peter Thiel. It's obviously much less complex than the actual Peter Thiel. And you're like, okay, brain, do a Peter Thiel simulation and then give me the answer to this question. Or simulate the part of myself that like tends to get social anxiety, and like get into that little simulation before you respond. So, I mean, and it's, obviously there's a lot of mystery to, what the brain is actually doing, but I don't take it too literally that like there's actually this childlike part or this, inside you.
Yeah. How did you get into questions? When do you use your first memory of thinking about, okay, questions are valuable and I should collect them or ask better questions?
Well, one of my ways I got into it was I started thinking about the 32 questions to fall in love, that set of questions that a researcher had developed with the idea that it creates bonding. And he had done a bunch of experiments. I think he actually even had had a case where people actually fell in love in his lab. And I started thinking about, well, what else can questions be used for? And one thing that became very interesting to me is, what are the best questions for self-reflection? So I developed a little experimental protocol where we would recruit people online, ask them a series of questions. So like we collected hundreds of possible like self-reflection questions. And then we would have the person answer them, just open-ended, write your answer. And then we would have them rate how valuable was the experience of answering that question. And this allowed us to assign a score to every question of like, how valuable do people find it to answer? And that allowed us to kind of rank order it. And then so we use that to create something we call life-changing questions, which you can do for free on our website, clearthinking.org. And we also made a really beautiful physical deck of cards so you can do it with friends and stuff like that. But it's called life-changing questions, and it's a whole bunch of questions that maximize this score of like producing value for the answerer.
Really interesting. And when you did that, how many questions are there total in that?
It depends on the version. We have lots of different versions. So we have one version that you do with a group, which is a certain length. And we have another version that you do yourself. And then we have a mini version if you don't have time. And then we actually have a pen pal mode where you can answer, and then it will send your answers to a friend that you choose. And if they answer, you can get their answers back. So
oh, wow,
we have
awesome.
like all different lengths depending on how much time you have. So
did you find that there's an optimal? So for example, they have the 32 questions to fall in love. Maybe there's an optimal number where they could have fallen in love with 20 questions or something like that. Did you find anything surprising just in the quantity of questions and how they stacked up in the moment, or really they could be separated? You could just ask one at a time.
The way I think about it is, imagine you ask your like most impactful question first, then your second most impactful next. And of course, it's just on average. It's going to differ per person. But let's say you do your best on average, one that's best on average first, and then so on. What you're going to get is this curve where each additional question is a little bit less valuable than the one before because you've rank ordered them.
Right.
And then the number of questions you ask is literally just a question of like how far down on that curve you want to go. There's going to be diminishing marginal return all the way down. You're going to get a smooth curve. And it's like, well, what point do you want to cut it off? So I don't think there really is a right number. It's just like, when is the bang for the buck not worth it for you anymore?
This is a curiosity question. I guess all of them are, but is there what's the number one question that was ranked the highest, if you remember it, in the life-changing questions?
I don't remember it. Also, like there were a bunch that were almost tied. So it's like, I don't know if we can really differentiate, but sorry about that. Should I say that again? It just, my bell rang.
That's okay.
Okay. All right. Anyways, there was, well, I'll tell you one of my favorites that also ranked really well is, what in life gets you truly excited? And the reason I love this question is, first of all, people find it really valuable to answer. But second of all, it's a way of cutting through the bullshit conversations we so often have when we are getting to know someone. It's a little awkward to ask, and you can kind of figure out a reframing of a different way to ask in different scenarios to make it less awkward. But it basically is like, what is important to you? What are you excited about? And as soon as you can figure out what's exciting to the other person, it just makes conversations dramatically better. And there's been a bunch of times where I've like used a variant on this question in a conversation with someone I just met. And suddenly their eyes light up and they start telling me about this thing they're like deeply passionate about. And we've just skipped like 20 minutes of bullshit conversation. So
talking about the weather or the latest sports figures or something like that.
Exactly.
Yeah, I really like that. Actually, Emerson Sparks, our mutual friend, got me to think this way because he has this thing about being really against small talk because you just think about all those. He's really good at adding all those hours. Whenever he thinks about one thing, he adds it up, across 40 years. And then it's like, okay, this is a waste. So but I still feel like it's helpful to build a relationship, not just jump in. So I like that for the bridging.
Yeah. And, if you think about small talk, it's not that small talk is useless. Small talk does serve a purpose. For one thing, you're learning to kind of trust that this person is like not going to just do something really weird suddenly. Like it's kind of gives you a comfort level with the person. And also it's just a familiarity thing. Like by spending time with them and getting familiar with them, they tend to breed liking. It also avoids awkwardness, so small talk is it's like a standard way of like not having awkward conversations. But it's also not optimized. So it's like, it does those goals, but it's not the best way to do those goals.
Yeah, that makes sense.
It's sort of the easiest way. It's the easiest way to achieve those goals. So it's like the lowest effort, lowest energy, lowest difficulty level version of that.
And so going back to your story of you, how long ago was that? 'Cause I feel like you've been, at least since I've known you, through clear thinking, and I feel like you always ask questions. How long ago was that for you?
Yeah, so I can't remember when we started working on life-changing questions. Maybe it was 5 years ago. I was certainly interested in questions before that, but that would like really took it to the next level where I was like, I want to systematically study questions. And I made lists of, hundreds of questions for reflection, trying to really understand like, what are the questions trying to do? What are the best questions and so on. And so, yeah, that took a turn for me.
What do you feel like you understand about questions, having collected hundreds and really thought about them, and also had the opportunity to test them with thousands of people responding to them and then rating the questions? What do you understand that others don't?
Yeah, I think that one thing that people don't necessarily recognize is that for almost any like important life domain, there's a set of questions that could potentially help you in it. And so, some of the categories I think about are self-understanding, learning, figuring out the truth, self-improvement, planning, friendship, group bonding. These are all areas where there are questions that will help in that domain. And so the idea of questions is just this super powerful thing that can be applied almost anywhere. And then it's about optimizing the right questions for the right goal.
And then when it comes to actually applying it, so it's like you've already done the work about getting the domain, the questions that are most powerful for that domain. Now, do you have them all memorized, and do you kind of naturally use them in the right timing? Or it's almost basically like creating a new habit. How did you make that into a habit?
Well, for some of these sets of questions, what we do is we launch programs on clearthinking.org, trying to ask you the appropriate questions to help you in that domain. For example, for big life decisions, we created a tool called the Decision Advisor. You can try it; it's free. And that tool essentially asks you a large number of questions about your decision to help guide you through it and help you avoid common pitfalls. So that's like a way we can systematize it and make it really easy for people to use the right questions for the right task. But then there's still we haven't implemented yet. There's still a lot of domains where we haven't built a program, and there it's just I'm just trying to collect them and keep them in mind.
But how is it for you in your own process? For example, are you using clear thinking all the time? Because I picture at some point they become automatic, and like, when you're in a group, you're like, okay, this question, and you don't even think about it.
Right. So basically, you want to install some form of trigger in your mind if you can. It's sort of a trigger response. It's like, I'm in situation X. Oh, I could use question Y or Z here. Like that'd be good. And so just to give an example of that, when it comes to questions to help you figure out the truth, let's say you're trying to figure out what's true about something and you're leaning towards a certain answer. You're like, well, I think that COVID has a certain level of, in fact, a certain infection fatality rate, right? Like you have a belief about that. You're trying to figure out the truth. There's a set of questions you can use there. And you want the fact that you're like on this search for the truth to trigger the right set of questions at the right moment. And so one of the questions might be, well, what evidence can I find against my belief? That's an excellent question in a truth gathering mode to have trigger at that moment. If you don't think to ask the question at that moment, it's not going to help you.
How do you do that? I feel like sometimes if it's a trigger, like waking up in the morning, or, you can set an alarm for it. But sometimes when it's an emotion, it takes a while to do it. Is there a way that you think about triggering it when you feel an emotion? Or, okay, I'm normally not going through life and thinking about, okay, I'm trying to find truth here. Although,
yeah. But you are trying to find truth. You just not like not have that like trigger installed of like, I'm in truth searching mode, therefore I should do these things. Okay. So we've done 2 different projects trying to get at this, what I think is this very important question. How do you trigger people to have the right thought at the right time? One of them is on the clearthinking.org website. We have a project called Happiness Habits. And what we do is we try to get you to associate an object in your environment with a mental maneuver. And so in that case, we do gratitude, we do mindfulness, etc. And we basically put you through a training program to try to get you to associate an object. So for example, if you say, you say to us, oh yeah, I will see a mirror like about 15 times a day. We're like, perfect. We're going to try to get it so that every time you see a mirror, you're going to have a grateful thought. And so these are kind of non-directed. Yeah. So these are non-directed triggers. They're like, you're just trying to increase the rate of a certain type of thought, but it's not that important when you do it. And we actually ran a study where we had a control group and we had an intervention group where they were enrolled in this program, and we tracked their happiness for 3 days. And people were actually significantly happier during that 3-day period when they were enrolled in this, where we were triggering these like thoughts of gratefulness and mindfulness, et cetera. So that's like the generic version. Then if we get into the more specific version, we're working on a project. It's still very early stage, but it's called Thought Saver. And Thought Saver, one of the goals of it is to allow you to install these triggers. And so we're basically trying to develop technology that will make this a lot easier to install have the right thought at the right moment based on the right stimulus. Yeah.
Is there what are the objects for you, or what are the things for you that for now might be automatic, but are there systems that have worked personally well for you?
Yeah. So one that's worked well for me is just trying to memorize the cognitive biases at like a deep level. So for example, understanding not just like what the bias is, so I could explain it, but like having generated a bunch of examples of each bias, trying to think about when I might fall for the bias. And that when you're kind of attacking the understanding at multiple levels simultaneously, like where am I going to see and this is where questions come in. It's like, where am I most likely to see this bias in my own life? Like that's a great question to ask. Or where in the past could I have used my knowledge about this bias? And you're trying to tie it into your like neural network in such a way that then that when you see that pattern in real life, like the thought comes to mind, like, oh wait, this might be this bias. And then there's questions you can ask yourself at that point. So let's take, for example, the planning fallacy. The planning fallacy is a very common issue that occurs where people underestimate how long a project will take, or how many resources it will cost, et cetera. There's various reasons for why this occurs, but it's super common. So what you want to do there is you want to install the pattern of the planning fallacy, like connecting it in with all these questions, like when am I likely to see this? When would this have occurred to me in the past, et cetera, et cetera. And then when you're going about your real life and you're about to make an estimate for how long a project will take or how much a project will cost, suddenly you want to get it to like, so that trigger occurs without you even, having to do anything about it, just like, oh, planning fallacy. And now you have your follow-up questions. Oh, okay, this seems like it might be the planning fallacy. So you have follow-up questions like, okay, am I sure that I've accounted for all of the different things that need to be done? Have I, put in a buffer for like unknown unknowns, et cetera, et cetera?
I really like that. So the way I'm associating in my head is there's stimulus, and there's network. So the stimulus could be external. So it's just a physical object, but it could be internal, that you've just planted this in your head such that when it happens, your mind just associates the two. And then I think about it as a network is like you're trying to network in these things into your life. It could be physically and not just one association, but multiple associations. So if you ask the question, where have I seen this in my life, or where might I see this? Those sorts of things start to wire it to almost look for it, like the reticular activation system almost of most of this in reality we're ignoring, but you start to look for it in your head.
Yeah, a really common misconception is that you don't really need to know things that can be memorized because you could just look them up. And if you think about that idea that like, oh, well, I could just look this thing up. What you don't realize is that you will not even think to look it up in most cases. So, so if like, an easy example is like the Pythagorean theorem, because yes, you could always look up the Pythagorean theorem, but if you haven't encoded in your mind the pattern of when the Pythagorean theorem is needed, like, oh, I know two sides of a triangle, I'm trying to, calculate something else about the triangle. If you haven't encoded that pattern, you will never think to look up the Pythagorean theorem. And therefore, even though you could in theory look it up, it's not going to help you. So it's actually not the formula you need, it's the pattern you need.
And the pattern is where it works, when it's relevant.
Exactly.
Which is kind of like the examples.
Yeah, exactly.
Really interesting.
The Pythagorean theorem is, it's an example where it's clear cut, but it's not something that most people would ever actually need in real life. But, you think about so many self-help techniques, they have exactly the same property where it's like, you need to know the pattern when the technique is useful. And then maybe you could look it up at that moment, if you're not in a rush or anything like that. But if you miss the pattern, you're never going to think to use it.
How, let's just take a typical day for you. You're working, you're having meetings, you're reading a book, let's say, or doing something, going online. And how is reflection built into that? So let's just assume you have all the questions now. What does that look for you? How many questions are you deliberately asking yourself? And then how much time are you spending and when?
Right. So a lot of it is driven by triggers. So I'll be working with my teams. And one of the questions I try to help them with every week is like, okay, were there any problems that came up in your work? Do you have any blockers? And then those often generate like, sometimes, a lot of times it's just, oh, there's no big deal. Nothing happened really of note. But sometimes it's like, oh, I got stuck on this thing. Okay. And that's when, okay, now a new set of questions come out of like, how do you get someone unblocked? How do you get to the root cause? Something that I have been thinking about more and more lately is that to solve problems, you have to build a little mental causal model of the problem. And so questions come into play very deeply because the questions enable you to build a little causal model. So let's just give an example. Let's say an employee says, "Oh yeah, sorry, I didn't get that stuff done. I know I said I would get it done, right?" Okay, well that is a potential problem. Maybe it's no big deal. Maybe it's just a fluke. But let's say this happened a few times now. Now there's a lot of different possibilities of like what's really going on. And, I think a kind of, mid-skill level boss will just kind of put pressure on the employee not to do it again. And that might work. But the problem is if that person doesn't know how to make it not happen again, it will totally fail. It will just stress the person out and fail and make their job, make them less happy. So I think a more skilled boss will actually start asking questions to try to build a little mental causal model of like, why is this person not getting their work done? What's going on? I have different hypotheses and my questions are going to help me sort between them. I build this little model. And once I have the model, now I have a prediction about what the right intervention is.
Yeah, really interesting. So it's almost like a if then our branching thing where you ask the initial questions for diagnosis. And then once you have that, it could, depending on the path, it could lead to different questions.
Exactly.
I've really gotten deep on Ray Dalio's his approach to problems. Have you done that before?
I am not such a principles-based person. I've been thinking about this recently. Like, what is a principle really? Like, I've been pondering this, and what I've come to thinking on this is that a principle is sort of a pre-computed answer to a question. So it's like let's say you have a principle of like always tell the truth, which is something that I aspire to do. Well, that principle is really a pre-computed answer to anytime you have a question of like, should I tell the truth? It's like, my principle says yes, so I'm just going to do it. I don't have to recompute an answer for each scenario, right? And so the interesting thing to me about principles is that like, so what problem are they really trying to solve? Well, one, they can reduce cognitive burden because instead of having to try to answer the question each time it comes up, you already have a pre-computed answer. Two, they can sometimes overcome weakness of will because like maybe you, in this particular case, you have like, you really want to not tell the truth because like it's less stressful for you or something. But like if you could just learn to follow your principle as like a habit, it can actually be like, oh, well, that's my principle. That's the thing I live by. So I'm just going to do it anyway. And the third thing is that principles can help solve coordination mechanisms because even if a bunch of people don't necessarily agree with each other on every point, they might be able to agree on principles. And then if they agree on the principles, they reach a consensus on the principles. Then when they're making decisions, they can all use the same decision-making like elements.
I'm going to put a marker in there because I want to go deeper. But if I go
Sure.
deeper on that, then we're going to go away from the what I was going at. So for Ray Dalio, he has this idea of problems of just this is kind of outside of his principles work, but
Okay,
he
yeah.
logs problems. So when employees feel an emotion during the day, particularly let's say really angry or something like that, that's a trigger for them to log. Okay, who are they around? What were they working on? Or if a problem happens, you log it and then you reflect on it. Okay, what were the root causes of it? What were the symptoms of it? What's the severity of it? And then once you have the root cause, then you go towards, okay, what can we do to solve it? But it sounds very similar to what you're talking about there as well.
Yeah, totally. So if you think about patterns triggering questions, like one of the best triggers for questions is there's a problem, right?
Right. Yep. So there's a problem is one trigger. Okay, so that's one that you look at in your daily going through your day of when you're talking to employees, asking about if there's any problems, and then helping to build a causal model, and then do the experimentation to solve it. What are other areas where you apply it in your day-to-day life?
Yeah. So another good one is planning. So you're about to begin, making a plan to try to achieve some goal, and that's a great time for questions. And so simple questions like what could go wrong with this plan. Another question that sort of can work even better is you do the pre-mortem technique where you say, okay, actually assume that this plan fails. Why? Right? Like let me. And so you're going back to the search engine analogy. You're giving a query to your brain like this thing failed. Now generate the reason, right? And it will usually come up with some reasons of why it failed. I also use this when I'm recruiting CEOs. Like I'll ask people that know the CEO well, the potential CEO well. Like imagine that this person started a company and it failed, but not for the reasons that companies usually fail. Instead, it fails for a reason that relates to this person. What do you think the reason is?
Yeah, it is kind of amazing. I actually really love the pre-mortem as well question, but it is amazing that you can actually predict your own failure. It's like,
Yeah.
but even like I asked this, I love asking this when people are setting habits of, okay, you said you're going to, read this amount per week or write this amount per week. How likely are you to actually do that? And you can often test it. And if it's like 50%, then you could be like, okay, what would it take to get higher? But I always found it interesting. It's that we can already, you would think that if we knew something wasn't going to work, then we would do something about it. But it's almost like we have to ask ourselves a question and then to fully hit that subconscious to bring that higher.
I think I think it's important to understand that there's many ways to know something. And so like you can know it in some like deep intuitive way, but not have raised it to your system to like, conscious awareness. And so these questions can like pull it up from the low level to the high level, like you're saying. And then now that it's in your like conscious working memory, now you can interact with it and explore it and make a plan and so on.
And when you think about planning, you even talking about like the daily planning, do you apply this with just, okay, here's what my day is going to look like. And then you ask yourself the pre-mortem question.
So I'm more of a person who likes to design my schedule rather than like each day make a plan. If that makes sense. So my schedule has like a certain, fixed element to it every week. And then that's kind of like, yeah. So I guess you could say it's almost like pre-planned rather than having to make a daily plan.
Right. That makes sense. And you're more on the weekly basis. You might be asking the planning questions.
Exactly.
And do you have like a routine where you do the week planning at a certain time or day, or does it just happen over the weekend at some point?
Well, no, for me, it's largely like preset for months. Like basically I kind of have my work schedule already mapped out and it's just like the same each week. So just to be a little clear on that. So for example, Monday mornings I always leave open for like working on anything that needs to prepare me for the week. So that's just like open block of free work time. And then I'll have certain times when I do phone calls with my teams. And then I'll have other blocks where I leave open. So I have more time to work on like longer term strategy and things like that.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. So you're not planning exactly what you're going to do in the blocks, but you will plan out the blocks. Okay, so far we've talked about problem and planning. And then are there other areas, let's just focus on the unit of a day where you're like, okay, like for you, is it ever like, okay, here's my half-hour chunk at the end of the day where I'm going to reflect, or I'm going to talk with my partner and we go through these questions every day? Is it that regimented, or is it more seamless in the day where it's just like a quick question at one point in the day?
I think that the worst situations where you don't ask questions, then the next level is where you like have explicit time. Like I'm going to ask these questions these times. And then the ultimate version of this is like the pattern in the world triggers the question in your mind at the right moment when it's ideal. And then there'll still be some like set aside planning time, maybe an annual review or something like that. But like to me, the thing to aspire to is like to actually get it to the point where the world triggers the right question for that action. However, I think just building in time for questions is like a great way to get up to that.
I really like that. It's similar with mental models, or most things learning, you have to be deliberate at first, set aside time, and then the goal is you use it automatically. And one thing you've done that I find really interesting is just you've really started being active this year on Twitter, and then just doing, typical posts of content posts. And then you switch toward asking a ton of questions. And like a really high volume of questions. And then also you have your prediction of the responses. Can you tell me more of the story behind that and how it's been going, what you've learned?
Yeah, I've been really enjoying it. Yeah, I basically, so in terms of questions, every morning I ask myself, what's a topic that I think is valuable? And then once I pick the topic, then I either will try to tweet about the most valuable thing I can think of about that topic, or I'll tweet a question about it. And so I, if I don't think of something in the morning, then I'll try to think of it, some point the rest of the day. But that to me has been like really valuable. Like, I think it's weird for people to say that like Twitter made them smarter, but I actually feel like Twitter has actually enhanced my thinking, because it forces me to do this like exercise that is so valuable, which is, what is the most important thing I can say about this topic? And it forces you to like try to extract like your knowledge of it and squeeze it down into 280 characters. So I've found that really valuable, and also it's increased the volume of ideas, because it's like now I'm actually generating even more ideas than I was before. So I like that a lot. In terms of polls, basically once I got a large enough Twitter following, I could start getting a reasonable sample size of my polls, and so then it became a way of just saying, I'm curious about this thing about humans. What do people say about this? And I've already asked my Twitter followers about their demographics, like their age and gender and where they live and stuff like that. So I already have a sense of like, who am I asking, right? Because that's important. Not different people are going to give you different answers, but I already know like who my audience is. I know who I'm asking. And so now anytime I'm curious about human nature in any domain, I can just throw it out as a Twitter question in a few minutes. But then what I realized is that to get the most out of that, I should actually have an anticipation. So then I started actually beneath almost all of my Twitter polls, I actually make my prediction, which I obscure, so it's not so easy to.
I like it.
I do them upside down.
These characters where you have to really squint and read upside down to be able to actually see it.
Exactly. And so the point of that is to try to improve my learning on this even more, which is like, my brain thought the answer was this. Now I read the poll answers and I see it's different. And now I can do that update between what I used to think it was true and what's actually true, which I think makes it much better for learning than merely reading the answer. Because when you merely read the answer, a lot of time your brain is like, oh, that makes sense. Even if it's actually not what you would have predicted.
And have there been areas where you've been really surprised that come top of your mind that you've learned from polls that are like, actually, this is very different. Let me look into this. My belief is wrong.
So one of them that really surprised me is, unfortunately, Twitter only has 4 answer options you can give from a poll, so it's frustrating. But one of them I asked about which of the 4 negative feelings they feel the most often. And I was quite surprised that people said sad was the number one. I would not have thought that. So that's something I want to investigate more, because I guess I didn't think of sadness as being like such a hugely prevalent emotion. I guess partly, probably, we all have this bias towards thinking that other people are more like we are. And so it's probably because I don't feel sad often that I sort of was so surprised by that. Yeah.
Really interesting. So I guess what as I'm listening to it, it's like one thing is you're seeing, we always assume everyone's like us. So you're just seeing where you're unique, that's valuable on multiple levels and ways, and helps you communicate to people better, and also just realize your own unique strengths or weaknesses. And then it also is really interesting because it gives you a hunch or something, a thread you can pull on for research. You're as someone who loves to learn and explore things, it gives you new avenues for exploration. So it doesn't
whenever you're surprised, it shows there's an opportunity to learn. That's like essentially the emotion of surprise is like your prediction of reality did not meet reality. So you could have just been like unlucky. It could have just been a weird fluke, like sometimes that happens. But more often, it actually shows that there's something wrong with your model of the world. And so one thing, by doing these tweets and making prediction, if I'm surprised, that means there's something to learn there. Now, maybe I learn it just directly reading the poll, or maybe I have to go research the thing, or maybe I have to go do a more robust study. But it shows there's a learning opportunity.
What have you learned about asking questions as a result of you have hundreds of people answer each poll? Has it improved your question asking? And if so, how?
Yeah, it has, because I've seen like sort of every misinterpretation. So it made me, so one thing to note is that if someone is trying to get a certain answer from a poll, there's a pretty good chance that if they're savvy, they'll be able to get that answer they want, because there are many ways to word things, and there are wordings that will make something look good or bad. So for example, let's say you want to make it seem like people are against gun control. You could be like, do you think that the people's constitutional right to gun ownership should be removed. And people are going to be more aversive to that because like people believe in the Constitution, right? Whereas if you say, should people be able to buy any gun they want anytime they want, then people are going to be more opposed to that because like even people who are a fan of guns don't necessarily think that just like it should be no holds bar, anything goes. You know what I mean? So someone who's like trying to get a certain answer can manipulate wording. But if you're trying to figure out the truth, which hopefully you're trying to do, then you have to think very carefully about which wording actually gets me the truest answer to my actual question. And so that's just something I don't have like broad takeaways other than to say it takes a lot of practice to get your wording to actually match what you're intending to convey and actually get the answer to the question you thought you were asking rather than just the question that other people thought you asked.
Do you keep a list of questions? And then once you have a question, do you spend, let's say, 10 minutes refining the question? Or I know one post I liked from James Clear, he was saying for how to succeed on Twitter. And one of them was after you're finished the post, spend an extra 10 minutes trying to refine it. And during that 10 minutes, you could do things like making it less leading. How is that for you of your process with questions?
Yeah, exactly. I usually make a quick first draft and then it's fitting it into a tweet is also really challenging for complex questions or philosophical questions. But then, going back to reading it carefully, trying to think, is this actually clear? How can I make it clearer? This idea that I think you and I both believe in, which is that if you can make the best version of a thing in the world, it's just dramatically more likely to succeed than if you make kind of like the second best or fifth best. Yeah. And it's worth investing the time doing it well. And, I think that's a really powerful and good idea, but there's also a micro version of that idea, which is that like, if you spend an extra 10 minutes refining your tweet and you can actually make it like the best tweet anyone's seen on that particular topic, then it's much more likely to do well than if it's just like the third best someone's seen on that topic. So so it's sort of like a lower version of the bar because, it's just a tweet. You're not going to spend 3 hours on it, but you can still try to make it the best tweet your audience has ever seen about that thing.
Yeah. I like that. Yeah. For Blockbuster, I've also updated my philosophies. Before I used to feel like it has to be comprehensive, but I think something that's Blockbuster could be a quote that really just is the most simple capturing of that idea that really resonates and it spreads. So I like that. And it's interesting of just looking, thinking about thought leadership, and we all have this platform where hundreds of millions of people, even billions, are actually fairly regularly creating content. That questions are, I think I've noticed across Facebook and Twitter that they get a lot of engagement. So, which makes sense because when people answer it, then that creates a comment, which is a signal there's engagement. How do you think about questions as a form of content for thought leadership and the role that could play?
Yeah. So another thing I think about when I'm writing questions, especially, if I'm putting one in a tweet, is like, what is going to be valuable to the person responding? Because there's really two motivations for them to answer the question. One is the value they get from the process of reflection. The second is the interest in seeing the answers of others, right? Because they don't get to see it until they answer. And so those are the two draws to work with. And you want to deliver ideally both, but at least one of the two. Otherwise, why would people answer it?
Right. I could see a third one of just some form of self-expression. Like you just want to.
That's true, but they're anonymous. So
yeah.
But still maybe the people get a value out of that. Yeah.
Yeah. It's really interesting of just, I could see somebody in the future, just that's all they do is just, they're really good at asking questions. And, you want to follow that person because following them has all the benefits that you talked about that helps you plan things. It makes you smarter. You want to share the questions with friends. And could you see that somebody just being, that's their thing?
Well, Ayla, if you've heard of Ayla, she is the master of asking questions on Twitter. And I believe she's asked 1,500 questions at this point. She has a spreadsheet of everyone she's ever asked.
Wow, that's really cool. Yeah, I've seen in the post that you've also talked about her as an inspiration for asking questions on Twitter and making that part of your practice.
Yeah, she definitely inspired me in the Twitter front in terms of the value of asking questions.
And then now you're becoming a professional question asker in another way, where you have your own podcast. What's it been like for you asking questions via podcast, and have you learned anything deeper about questions that way?
Yes, that's really interesting because in my podcast, I try to not make it an interview. I try to make it like my favorite kind of conversation. So it's like a fun conversation you have with a friend about an important idea where you're like building on each other So that's what I try to do. But still, asking questions is of course essential to that, right? Because like you have to get the conversation started. You have to like pull out of this person. And there are times I'm frustrated myself because I'm like, I know this person has a really interesting thing to say about this, and somehow I didn't fully get the full value like of what they had to say because I didn't ask it in the right way. And I think one of the interesting things is that people don't necessarily remember everything they've ever like written on a topic. So it's like if you have someone you're like, oh, I know they wrote this great blog post on that, then you just throw a question at them. They actually might like fail to get something nearly as interesting as the thing they said previous. It's like, wait,
That's
but
a
don't
good
you
point.
mean this?
I felt that.
Yeah. So in terms of asking good questions, I think a big part of it is trying to make it as easy as possible for the respondent to say something that's valuable to your audience. And I think one way to do so, my preferred way to do that with my podcast is I actually ask my guest, what are the 4 or 5 most important things that you want to talk about? So basically, what are the ideas that matter to you? And so basically, they should be like super enthusiastic and ready to go because like they've told me this is like one of the most important things for them to talk about.
That's a really, I remember that when I was on your podcast and those really helped me because there's certain ideas I kind of think about it as a bell curve of excitement for ideas that the beginning part of the curve, you're just like not really excited, but then you get excited and something triggers you and explore it more. And sometimes you become less excited as you go along, but other times you get really more excited. But then as you learn more about it, then you kind of it starts declining where you're like, okay, I've mastered this, I've integrated into my life and I'm on to the next thing. So finding people where they're at the peak of something is an interesting part. And I feel like your questions help do that.
Right. They're like peak excitement. Yeah. So, So I guess I didn't make this clear. When a guest is going to come on, I have this huge list of questions for them. And it's a meta list of questions because basically it's a list of questions about what are the things that you think are most important to discuss. And so I try to help them get it in many different ways. For example, asking like, what's something you believe that others don't? So that's like a classic question, but also questions like, what's an idea you use in your life that other people don't use? What's something that you've changed your mind about that you think is important? So there's like many, many different ways to help them stimulate, like what's the most important thing for them to talk about?
Yeah. Okay. So another area I really was excited to talk with you about with the questions was there's this certain type. So everyone says, okay, what are the best practices with questions? You want to ask open-ended questions and, what do you believe that others don't? But what I've noticed, I don't know the name of it, but there's almost like visualization questions that are out there. So, and sometimes I see patterns in them. So one of them is kind of like a Dickens style pattern of, I've seen this in transformational work. If you Charles Dickens, Christmas Carol, where there's the ghost of Christmas, past, present, and future. So you have people visualize, okay, if you keep on following the same patterns you have right now that are limiting you, where does that take you in 5 years, 10 years? Okay, and then at 10 years, you're this age. What's happening in your life because of that? And then you talk about all these, if you get that confidence and you start doing those things in your business of writing, publishing every day for years, where could that lead? And then it sets a frame where you answer it very differently. I've also heard another example that a friend told me is more of the elevator one, where for thought leaders, where you have your current self and you're in a building, you take an elevator down and the door opens and there's this self from you of 5 years ago before you had this big insight that made you who you are today. But the door is going to close in a second. So you can only tell them something within 30 seconds or something. It's a long elevator, I guess. The door stays open for a while. What would you say? And so something about the visualization part of it pulls new things out. And I was curious if you've explored that at all.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. So first of all, going back to the sort of search engine analogy, like a question is like giving a query to your subconscious. The nature of the subconscious is not inherently verbal. Like your subconscious represents concepts as sort of like in some pure form. It's not in words. And so the output of the subconscious could be words, but it could just be a visualization, or it could be a scent, even like a smell, right? You could ask your mind, like, what does orange smell like? And then it will like try to answer it with a scent. So it is really multimodal.
Yeah.
And I think that that's really what's going on is like, partly it's that you can query it visually. Like, what is my life? Like, let me imagine my life if I keep these certain patterns. That's like a visual query. And so that's a really powerful concept. But there's another thing that's going on there, which is that you can use visualizations to make something more visceral. So for example, the classic trolley problem, from philosophy, which is very often repeated. It's like, oh, a train is going down the track and it's going to run over 3 people on the track, but you can flip the switch so it runs over 1 person. Should you do it? And people will give a kind of answer. But if you imagine you are actually standing there and you actually see the train coming and you have 30 seconds to make a decision and you see 3 people that are about to get hit, and then you look to see if you can divert the track and there's 1 person and you like look at them in the eye and like pulling the switch means you're literally killing this person. Like that's actually very, very different. And the abstract, verbal description and answering it doesn't really take us to there and isn't necessarily an accurate reflection of what you would actually do. But by trying to vividly imagine it, you can probably get closer to what you would actually do. Maybe not all the way there, but closer. And so I think that's the second element of visualization, is it can actually make things more realistic based on like our true behavior.
I could also see it being, if the goal partly is to trigger certain things in your day or emotions to a question, I could see it being helpful there is if you're imagining, like, let's say walking through your day at the next planning meeting and, your partner says something and then you ask this question, that could probably wire it deeper.
Absolutely. And one visualization trick I do with planning is like, let's say I have a big project. I try to actually visualize all the different steps. Like, okay, this has to happen. This has to happen. This, and what I find really powerful about that is it's a great way to realize that there were missing steps, because then you're like starting to imagine yourself doing something. You're like, wait, that doesn't make any sense because I didn't do that thing. So I wouldn't have that thing at that point. And like, so just as a simple example, imagine like you have a bunch of errands you have to run today and they're kind of complicated and you have to get this thing and bring it there. It's like, if you actually imagine doing each of the steps, you'll realize that like, oh, I should do that before this and not the other way around. Whereas you might not, just thinking about it intellectually, you might not realize that.
Right. Thinking about it intellectually sometimes even gives the feeling like you understand it. And so that could be a reason we don't actually probe it deeper. But I really like that. I've just kind of, it makes me really excited and then also feel overwhelmed. I feel like there's so many opportunities to ask better questions at the right time. At one point, I bought like 7 journals with the intention of, okay, I'm going to put one next to my bed, and that's going to be when I wake up. And then it's going to be for one thing. Other one's a surprise journal. And I think I just chewed off way too much up front on it, but I could see if somebody were just getting started at asking better questions and logging it in their own life for their, let's say, to learn better, what would you recommend?
Yeah, so for learning in particular, questions are very valuable. So there, I would say the kind of ideal trigger is like you just learned something new. Like let's say you spent an hour reading something, or you just learn about a new idea. So one question that I think is really valuable is like, try to explain this. What would I say to explain this to someone? And like some people like to use the query of like a smart 12-year-old. How would you explain this to a smart 12-year-old? Because it forces you to like get rid of all the bullshit words and like, complicated ways of saying things and just focus on like, what is the actual idea? Or, you could use my method, which is like, I call it tweeting the core, where you'd say, what is like the most valuable part of this? You could explain in 280 characters. And then also we talked about, or mentioned this a little bit, but like, how do you tie it into your behavior? It's like, so you can ask the question, what could you have used? When could you have used this idea in your past? Like if you had known this in the past, when would you have used it? And then similarly, you can say, well, in my future, when can I imagine using this concept? And because the purpose there is to try to tie it in so that you begin to actually think of it at the right moment when you need it. So I think those are all ways to make the learning actually stick a lot better. And it's kind of incredible the amount of learning we waste because we don't take like 5 minutes to integrate it. So we like read a whole book and then like 5 months later, we can't remember anything about it because we never integrate the information into our neural structures. One other last question I'll mention for learning is, what other idea is this related to that I already know?
Oh, right.
Yeah.
Really interesting. This is also inspired by Emerson, and then I made it my own as well. But I've called it the ha hack. So number one, whenever you're reading something, the H stands for highlight. You get to that highlight point where something is interesting enough that you would just highlight it. You might not even know why. That's a good point to pause and then ask yourself, how do I apply this in different areas of my life? So it's very similar to contextually applying it. But I actually really like adding an E for explain, try to explain it to someone else.
Yeah, totally. Because when you try to explain it, it's kind of like that, what we were talking about, where you like visualize a plan to find the gaps. As soon as you try to explain something, you realize what you don't know about it most of the time, because you're trying to explain it and you just hit a gap and you're like, oh wait, how does that thing connect to that other thing? Yeah.
Yeah, it is really interesting. What they shared in common is that questions can help you find gaps in your thinking.
Exactly. One of the most valuable things I found to do with entrepreneurs, because like how often I've entrepreneurs reach out and say, oh, can I tell you about my idea and get your feedback, is I get them to tell me, I basically ask, for who is this product going to solve what problem at what moment in their life? So it's like, to describe it in the level of detail of like, person X is walking down the street and they would have done Y, but because of your product, they now do Z, and that's how they're better off. And so just basically try to get them to like give me this incredibly concrete visualization of like a particular person being benefited in a particular way at a particular time. And what I usually find happens when I try to get them to do this is one of two things. It is for early stage startups. One of two things happens. Either there's a gap in their plan. Like it's like, oh, wait, I guess we need to do this thing that we hadn't thought about. Or they actually don't know. They actually just don't know who they're trying to solve what problem for at what time. It turns out their idea is like more abstract. And so this is the best thing I found to do. If like I only have 10 minutes with an entrepreneur, I try to do this exercise. So
yeah, fascinating. So I feel like some themes we're hitting on are, one is this embodiment of trying to get into that specific situation. And that really helps you think maybe more accurately to how it would be in that situation. Could be for you, could be for a customer. And then also this idea of exemplifying, similar to visualizing, but it's another way of just seeing yourself use it in different places. And just connecting this abstract idea to lots of places and things. So it's a rich network.
Yeah, exactly. You can get this weird effect where knowledge gets like isolated in its own little network. It's like, I think this happens often when people are like learning about parts of the brain, is like, well, they imagine this picture of the brain and then they've got this part and it connects to that part and this, but it's like, it doesn't tie into any of the other stuff they know. So they can't actually use it for anything.
Yeah, I think about it as, let's say rural, like in terms of, you picture the world map, you picture different countries, and then there's connections between those. I'm trying to build a city in my mind where people are just, lots of things are thinking, versus I think it's very easy to get something where you have almost different fiefdoms and there's no triggers to them. So it's almost like they're orphaned in their like rural areas. There's not a lot of lights connecting them.
That's a great metaphor. I like it.
So another thing is, it's interesting. We're going so many different ways to look at questions. So another way to think about questions is, how do you answer them? So you could think in your head, you could tell somebody your answer. You could tell, I actually keep voice notes for myself. I think that's better.
Writing is a big one too.
Writing it to yourself. Yeah. But then you could write it, like I have a whiteboard over here. I will answer it differently than if I have a small piece of paper, answer differently than if I have a laptop. So I feel like how we answer actually influences a lot. How do you think about that?
Well, these days, when I'm trying to answer a question, I usually want to be able to share it with others because it just magnifies the value. So I often frame it as like I'm writing an essay. And often when I start an essay, I have like vague ideas about what I want to say, but I don't really know exactly what I want to say. And usually it's an exploration of a topic. So for example, one I did recently is like, what does racism mean? And so I read these two books that both talk about racism. I thought a bunch about it. I thought about all the different like times I've heard people talk about racism. And what I realized is that there's like this huge number of different definitions of racism. And actually one of the things that's confusing people so much today is that people are using different definitions and talking past each other. So out of all that, I was like, okay, let me condense this into something that I can share with other people. And that's sort of like how I structured my like learning path, was to be able to answer the question for others.
So I look at it similarly. I coined a term, explanation effect. So nice. The fact that explaining things helps you understand it better. And I look at it as a pyramid. So at the top, the picture, this pyramid is split in two places. at the top is self-explaining. So you could explain it to yourself in a lot of different ways through writing, voice, or there's also rubber ducking in programming. You know rubber ducking?
Is that where you tell it to rubber duck? What you explain your problem you're having to the rubber duck, and
Exactly.
you often just solve your own problem. Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah. And then once you get to the other side, it's you're explaining to others, and there's different levels of that. There's informal conversations. Then there's, let's say, a mastermind, more formal, let's say a mastermind conversation. And then there starts to be thought leadership where you're really packaging it really well to people maybe from a broader audience could find it relevant. And, if you're getting a livelihood, that I feel like every level you go up towards makes it so you actually learn it more deeply. The more valuable it is to other people, probably the more you've learned it better.
I think that's right, because to make it valuable to others, you kind of need to know a lot of details that you then don't actually share, but they just help you build the scaffold of like, what's the most important part of this, and how do I say this, and so on. Actually, more and more recently, I've been finding a great deal of value in starting ideas as a tweet. So like, okay, I want to think about an idea. First, let me tweet about it. Then if that's nice, because it like is a nice small amount of time that I can use to think about it. So it's like very bite sized. It's easy to fit in my schedule. And then I can see how people reacted. It resonated. People find it valuable. And then I can consider if it like, let's say I'm like, oh yeah, people seem to actually find this interesting and valuable. Then I can consider like, okay, now let me turn into a Facebook post. And that's like the next level, ratcheting it up. And that's like much more detailed. And there on Facebook is usually where I get a lot of critique. People make a lot of suggestions for improving it. And that brings me the ratcheting up one level higher, where now I'm taking all their suggestions and critiques and I'm saying, oh, thank you. That's a great point. Let me update the post. And it's kind of becoming this living document. And then that leads to the final ratcheting, which is like, okay, making it an actual essay that I'm going to release on my website or somewhere else.
Right. And then maybe a book after that, or
eventually a book, maybe we'll see.
And then a book series like Nassim Taleb's Inserto or something like that. Yeah, I have the same exact sort of system. It's interesting with like taking a step back on that. I got this wording from the book called Little Bets, where they talk about those systems, experimentation systems in different domains. So you could apply it to movie scripts where there's the outlining, then storyboarding, and so on. And then there's different reviews at each level. And I forgot where I was going. Oh, what I think is really interesting is it's really a different way of thinking. It's like a social cognition almost. So number one, you're getting feedback from people on what's interesting and what's not interesting. And then that's guiding it. So it's like strengthening certain pathways that of your thinking you wouldn't have gone down unless other people are interested in it. And then it's also
building your prediction too. Yeah.
What do you mean by that prediction?
Well, you're basically, one thing that's really important to me is to model what other people find valuable. So it helps me hone my like internal prediction engine of like, will people find this idea valuable or not? And I aspire to get to the point where I can just predict in advance that something will be really valuable to people, and I don't even need to check because I'm so accurate. I'm not there yet, but I'm getting better and better. For now, a couple of years, everything I post on Facebook, I make a pre-prediction about how people will react to it.
Interesting. You put that in a spreadsheet?
Yeah, I have like a huge spreadsheet. Yeah.
So you can actually literally see how accurate you are. You can see that actually getting better, your predictions?
Yeah. So I have confidence intervals that I track. So I'll predict like, I think it's going to be between 20 and 35 likes and stuff like that. I will add that I think there's one danger of doing this that people have to be careful of and steer clear of if they're using something like Twitter to evaluate like the resonance of an idea, which is it's very important that you focus on, did this idea resonate with people? Did they find it valuable? Not did people give me social kudos for saying the thing? Because that's a failure mode where it's just like, you're actually just optimizing for like being likable or like say, cheering on the thing that other people cheer on.
Right. If you say environment is important or something, and then people will cheer that on.
Yeah, exactly. So, but fortunately, I tend to write about things that are orthogonal to politics. So I don't get like either social kudos or social condemnation most of the time, because people are just like, what is like, this has nothing to do with like the topics that I'm used to, or even topics that are potentially controversial. Like, what is racism? I try to approach it in a completely orthogonal way, like at the point of view of a sociologist, being like, how are people using the word racism? What do they mean by that? What are the different options? Rather than trying to take a political side.
Yeah, man. I feel like I just was seeing our conversation, then I was seeing lots of different paths it could go down. There's so many pins.
Predicting the
I wanna
future.
put. Well, one thing in the thought leadership realm. So this is maybe just transitioning a little bit away from questions to thought leadership. Is what creates value long term for thought leadership. So let me start off by giving my personal philosophy on where we are and where we're going, and then to your thoughts on that. So I personally believe that we're in that start off with programming, where programming was and software was about 30 years ago. So we can take something from your head, type it in a computer. It's a software code and it can instantly run across anywhere in the world at no extra cost. There's a maintenance cost, but it's super scalable. And so the software industry has really grown over the past several years because of there's a whole funding ecosystem there's a whole education accelerators support. There's a whole philosophy about what it means to write good software or start a software company. And it's really developed. You can really see that progress. And when it comes to ideas and turning to that, I think it hasn't evolved as quickly. And so sometimes I've been wondering, okay, why hasn't it evolved? I think partially from a monetization. A lot of people who come up with ideas, they're doing it for free out of passion. Or so it's just in the past year or two where I feel like people like Substack, people are actually charging for their content, and courses are becoming bigger and people are buying courses more often. And so I like to think about is what does it mean to be a thought leader? Just like what does it mean to be a good software programmer or software startup? And part of it, I think at a core level, there's their ideas bank you have, and then there's how you express it. And so it's like, let's say the expression would be how good your writing is, how good you are at simplifying and creating titles. And then there's the idea part of you have to have a large database of ideas and be able to combine them in together into really attractive ideas that people will share. And I personally believe that the highest leverage thing is on learning really highly valuable content that's durable, that gives you the fodder so you could combine like Lego blocks that you could combine ideas together, that because you have those Lego blocks, no one else could even think about it because they don't have those same basics. And then the last thing is that I feel like there's a compounding advantage that happens because like if I want to write an article about physics or something, I would have to spend a lot of time just to be able to write something interesting about it. And so if you have a large base of knowledge, there's less feeling of competition that all these people that who could write the article that you're thinking about. So for me, I spend a lot of my time researching because of that. And I've heard you allude to things on this call about you start your day thinking about value and what's valuable to write about, what's true. And also you want to model what other people find valuable. So I hear you talking about value, but in your own words, what do you think it means to be a good thought leader long term?
Yeah, well, I like a lot of what you said. I mean, and it's extremely hard to be novel, right? Like there's so many people generating so many ideas. And personally, I think the idea of trying to be novel is like rather overrated. And I think most of the time when we think people are being novel, they're not just in the sense that others have thought about the idea before.
Right.
I think most of the time we call it novel. It's not really. And I'm kind of shocked sometimes to see like a paper from 1950 discussing an idea that like is now there's just a new paper that came out in 2020. And you're like, are you serious? Like, it's just, and I'm not someone who's studied history deeply, but I think that there's a lot more repetition of ideas than we acknowledge. So what I like to think about, and I believe you and I have discussed this before, is not so much being novel, but producing novel value. In other words, producing value that's not currently being produced in the world. That is to me what matters, not like being the first to say a certain idea, which you're probably not going to be. But I totally agree with you that if you want to say stuff that's more unique to you, which is necessary to produce novel value, because like if you're just saying what everyone else is saying, that's not novel value either. To produce things that are uniquely valuable, you have to push pretty far in one direction. So either you build up all these building blocks that you can combine flexibly, and so that allows you to create unique value, or you go deep enough in one area that you get to sort of the edge of it, and then you can produce novel value at that edge, or you play to some strength that you're like ridiculously unusual in. So sometimes that comes about because someone's like an expert in two random things that are unrelated. Like someone's an expert in, I don't know, artificial intelligence, but also they're an expert in, I don't know, like friendship or something like that. It's like, wow, maybe there's some crazy thing at that intersection. I don't know. Maybe there's not, but like, so they can get to the edge really fast by combining these like kind of weird things that nobody would combine. So that's a possibility. Or you just have some exceptional ability in some area and that lets you push that edge. Like you think about like Josh Waitzkin, like he clearly has an exceptional ability to learn things. And so he's able to like say very interesting things about learning that other people wouldn't have thought of. So I think that's kind of the way I frame thought leadership is spreading ideas in a way that produces unique value that nobody else is producing.
Yeah. And then how do you think about, how long do you picture yourself being a thought leader for the rest of your life?
I would like to be. I mean, basically, I feel like I'm on a quest. One, to understand how to figure out truths about the world, and then two, to use those methods to figure out truths, and then three, to use those truths to improve people's lives. And so, for me, the idea of being a thought leader, it comes out of my life mission because it's like as I'm on this quest to like figure out how to figure out the truth, to actually figure out the truth, and then figure out how to use the truth to improve people's lives. So many ideas come out of that then I can share with others, right? So to me, thought leadership is like a side effect of my life mission. It's not the mission in of itself.
Yeah, I understand. And that really comes across that you're really trying to figure out. It sounds like what's true and the Venn diagram of what's true and what's valuable. But it's interesting. I just was listening to a podcast with Noah Harari and Bill Gates, and they were talking about how many of the most valuable things in the world, like a lot of people would say religion is one of the most valuable things in their life, or let's say money, aren't real in a certain sense. They're stories. And I feel like there's a lot of beliefs that are actually really this goes to, let's say, Nassim Taleb. I feel like a lot of his stuff is kind of saying there's a lot of things that aren't necessarily true in the scientific way, but they're true in the real world, like it's Fat Tony sort of way, that it just works. And maybe we don't have the best explanation of it. So sometimes I wonder about that as a thought leadership too, is that there's a lot, I guess there's useful, it's not always true.
Yeah. So for me personally, like one of my deepest intrinsic values is like believing true things and spreading true things. And, I'm not, obviously I'm not always perfect at fulfilling this, but it really is a really deep value for me. So for me, it's a non-starter if I think an idea is not true. If I think it's false, but and like a lie, but useful, I'm going to try to avoid it. There are others that say, well, maybe the right lie is actually for the greater good. And that just totally is out of line with my value system. However, I will say that there are there's a trade-off between simplicity and accuracy, right? So there can be a lot of value in producing a model that's like only somewhat accurate, but is very simple.
Right.
And even though it's far from perfect, it actually improves people's understanding. So I think that to me, that's the question is not, is the model perfect? No model is perfect, but does the model improve people's understanding from where they're at? So an example of this is like children are often taught that like atoms are kind of like billiard balls, like bouncing around, right? And that's not really true. We know that that's not true. But I think it's still a useful model to teach children. I would have rather there's an addendum added saying, by the way, this is just an approximation. Later, you're going to learn about this thing called quantum mechanics when you're older that will tell you that. It's even weirder, but this is like a decent model to get you started. And it's much better than what you thought, before you learned any science.
Yeah. I don't feel like I have my wording right here, but I feel like I definitely was impacted by Trump and everything. And I don't want to go into politics, but I feel like one could fairly commonly say, okay, he's lying a lot, but it doesn't matter at some level. He's also the amount of votes he was able to become the president of the United States. And so it almost challenged some of my beliefs about how the world works. And then I just started noticing in different domains that there's a lot of times where there's understanding something, but if you just, in terms of, okay, let's say there's two parts to the world. One is understanding how physics works, right? And then that's one way. There's truth there, and that's really valuable. And you're not going to be able to build a rocket ship that goes to Mars by going off of non-truth.
You can't build a rocket ship out of lies. It's not going to fly.
Exactly. But on the other hand, we're living in the human domain where you're talking to people, you're working together and collaborating. And that's clearly, to me, not built on truth. And even, let's say, money or something like that, it's built on sometimes mutual belief and so for me, I feel like there's a lot of areas where I choose to believe things that are non-provable. Like, okay, I believe that life is going to get better, or I believe that when I'm coaching someone, I feel like they can really I guess it's more of a possibility that they can really have breakout and accomplish their goals. So it's not exactly the same, but I feel like it starts to go into the woo land. But I feel like there's a value to, as a thought leader, that you're able to create value by not just starting from truth. That do you understand where I'm going? I don't have it well thought out. Yeah,
I do. And I think this comes down to values.
Right.
There are comforting lies. There are comforting falsehoods. There are falsehoods that help people. There are also truths that help people. And because my value is very deeply rooted in truth, like I find it unethical to like purposely spread lies. To me, that just rules out all of those methods. Like, let me give you an example actually to illustrate this. So I have a friend who had this saying she found helpful, which was that like everything that happens to you, even if it's really bad, is the perfect thing to happen for you.
Right.
And she found this valuable. This made her feel better. But I would never use that method. And I also would never advocate it. Instead, I would say, let's find another statement that makes you feel better about bad things that's actually not deceiving yourself. Because we know, like, of course, the things that happen to you are not always perfect. Like, so how about, and you'd have to experiment to figure out which one works for you. But maybe you have another thing like, everything that bad that happens to you is a learning opportunity. That it probably is true, right? Like there's something to be learned from it, whether it's about your own resilience or about how to avoid that problem in the future or about the way life works or whatever, right? So I would look for something that has the benefits, but without the falsehood. And yeah, go ahead.
Is it actually falsehood though? Like, is money falsehood? Like, because I listened to the Yuval Noah Harari podcast talking about money as this idea that we created, or, the company doesn't exist, like there's not, like you can't go meet a company. It's this idea that we create.
I would just differentiate. Yeah, I would differentiate between an actual falsehood and something like money. I think of money as an intersubjective truth, which I think is how many people view it as well. Where, in other words, the value of money is true insofar as people believe it, but that doesn't mean it's false. Like if people are willing to give you a candy bar for $1, then $1 is worth a candy bar, and that is actually true. At the moment they stop believing it's worth a candy bar, it won't be anymore.
But it feels like most of things, and maybe that's just within it. That's still within your realm. You're calling it intersubjective truth, because I feel like that person's, what you said of your friend, that everything happens the best way possible, or something like that.
Everything happens is perfect, exactly as it's meant to be. Yeah.
So would that be an intersubjective truth?
I don't think so. See, I just think that that's false. Like, I mean, maybe there's some weird reading of the word perfect there that like makes it true, but I think by a plain reading of it, it's just a falsehood. And I do think that there's a very large number of falsehoods that are spread in society today, and they're not just intersubjective truths, which I don't have a problem with intersubjective truths, because intersubjective truths are true as long as people can believe in them, which is a form of truth.
Yeah, and I think we're probably in agreement that like blatant falsehoods of like, I don't know, the tree is green, and then we're trying to argue it's not. Those don't have it. We're not trying to do those as thought leaders. But sometimes I just think about for people as thought leaders of where to specialize in, that if you're trying to make the most value, trying to like stay in the realm, I feel like there's a lot of value in this intersubjective truth, because that's where people actually apply and use things. And that as humans, I feel like we're more designed for intersubjective truth than, reality truth, like physics truth.
Yeah, I think that there's definitely a lot to be said for that view. I think really though, part of this is about storytelling. And the way I think about that is that for any truth, there's like probably at least 100 ways to tell the story of that truth that is true. Like it's not a lie. But the point is that any fact has many stories that you could tell around it. And it depends on like which parts do you emphasize? How much time do you spend on every part? What words do you use to describe it, et cetera, et cetera. And so I think for me, the most ethical form of thought leadership is to try to always tell the truth. Obviously, we're all human. We're going to sometimes fail. We're going to make mistakes. We're going to, et cetera. But try to always tell the truth, but then to also optimize for the story around the truth that helps people use that truth the most, right? And that story has a lot of flexibility to it.
Okay. So I'm processing here. I think it's an interesting topic because it's like what really creates the value long term. And I think about this a lot because I think it's very easy as a thought leader to get caught in, okay, I just want to get the most Facebook likes, or I want to build a business, and that's going to be the most thing. Versus I appreciate, let's say, Nassim Taleb in the sense that you're work focusing on creating. First of all, he spent 40 hours per week learning since he was 16. So, applying all this wisdom, he applying it to his life and becoming a trader and testing out there. Then he's studying it academically. And then he's building ideas that could last the test of time. And I find that model of thought leadership really interesting. And so that's partially why I'm also just asking you all these questions. It feels like, do you resonate with the Nassim Taleb model, or do you look at yourself as a different approach to what you're trying to accumulate over time and share?
Well, I think that Nassim Taleb has come up with some really cool and powerful ideas, and also ways of describing them that make people understand the value of them. Like anti-fragility, I think is really cool, and the idea of a black swan. Like, surely I don't think he invented the concept of black swan, but I think he did a great job of like articulating the importance of it and what people misunderstand about it, and like adding a lot of value there. So I certainly respect that a lot. But it's like let's take something like internal family systems, right? Which is basically a way of doing therapy that involves you imagine these different parts to yourself. We alluded to this earlier. From my point of view, it is totally false to tell someone you have this literal like part inside you, this manager, is one of the terms they used inside you that's like doing this thing, and you've got to like talk to that manager. If you communicate to someone that you literally have this manager, that's actually misleading. But to say this is a useful introspective tool to imagine you have this manager and then to talk to the manager and this leads to positive outcomes, that's a totally legitimate and honest way to do it. So now I'm not saying that people are lying when they say that they really believe in like the manager in your mind or whatever. I'm not saying they're lying. They actually may believe that it's true, but I think it's false. So to me, there's an ethical way to do internal family systems based on my belief system, which is to communicate why the technique is valuable and what's actually going on to the best of your understanding. Does that make sense? It doesn't mean you can't use internal family systems if you don't believe that you actually have a manager.
But I wonder if that is actually what works long term. So part of the value of an idea is it has to be appreciated by other people and valued. Just like, I don't know, let's just say like dating or other things. It's not enough to be internally consistent or like, okay, I'm a really nice guy or girl, but to be a certain way. And so I feel like if you look at the thought leadership space or attention space, it's ideas competing against each other. And oftentimes the simple ideas really win. That, over time, if you even have a complex idea, that's going to be simplified. So I'm not arguing against what you're saying. And I agree. I feel like that's more accurate. But it also seems like what wins over time is the simple version that people can immediately understand and has an emotional part. And so if part of your goal is to have the most value in the world, that maybe there's trade-offs sometimes. It sounds like you're not willing to make those at some level, but I wonder if that would hurt long term.
Well, I don't think that simple means false. Like, going back to this idea of like a simple model is, it's going to be less accurate if you're trying to study a complex phenomenon, right? But the trade-off, there's always a trade-off between like simplicity and accuracy. And actually, as long as you're upgrading people's understanding, like they understand the thing better, they have a more accurate perception of like what's true after hearing the idea than before, then you've actually improved their thinking, you've improved their understanding of the world, not made it worse. If you have a simple idea that's totally false, then you've downgraded their understanding of the world. Now, I think in my ideal form of this, you would explain that this is a simple model and you say, this is not the complete complexity, but it's a really useful way of capturing a lot of value in a simple thing. And so that would be the best. But as long as you're making people believe more truth rather than less, then I'm in favor. But again, I would go back to just the incredible importance of storytelling. And I think if you have a good idea that is true, you still have to work really, really hard to tell the story around it in a way that resonates with people, the way that people find valuable. And a lot of work needs to go into there. And I think that that's vastly underestimated. And basically, I think that's how, so, it's like imagine two people, one who's like just spouting bullshit ideas, trying to optimize for like what will get clicks or what will get them famous or something. And you have another person who's trying to say true things that are useful. Like if the second person doesn't do good storytelling, then they're going to lose. But if they do good storytelling, then they can potentially compete and potentially even win the long term, because people are not like total morons. Like, yeah, some people will be fooled, but other people will be like, yeah, that person's kind of full of shit. That first person's kind of full of shit. So there's an advantage to the truth. But also, I think at a deeper level, it's like, what kind of impact do you want to have on the world? Like that first person who's just spouting nonsense, they're actually probably going to have a negative impact on the world. And I think that most people don't want to do that. Like they genuinely want to have that positive impact. So by constraining yourself to things that are true, they might be simplified versions of the truth. That's fine, as long as they're upgrading people's knowledge. I think that's a really useful constraint to making sure you have a positive legacy and not a negative one.
And how do you, so one part is the idea part, and we're talking about true and useful. How do you then think about the craft of it? You've talked about storytelling, there's voice. How do you think about developing your voice and thought leadership long term?
So I am not the world expert storyteller by any means. This is something I'm still very much working on and trying to get better at storytelling. But I think there's a lot of different elements to this. One is, can you make it visual and vivid for people? I think that's really powerful. So another way to do it is to say, can I like put this in a metaphor that people already relate to or understand? A third way is like, can I give a concrete example that like makes this meaningful to people? Like, oh, I've seen that happen, or that's happened to me, or wow, that was a really amazing example, like amazing story that also illustrates a principle. So these are all aspects of storytelling. And then of course, like if you really want to embed in a story, you want to push storytelling all the way, then you need to start thinking about the narrative and like the narrative arc and conflict in the story. Maybe even the hero's journey or whatever. It depends how far you want to push it.
And I've noticed you don't really use as much storytelling in your writing. I feel like it's more you're exploring the idea more, and you're really breaking it down really well and simplifying it. How do you think about? I'll just share for myself. I'm motivated in a similar way, and so for me, storytelling, like I realize that helps communicate the idea, but it's also like it's not as exciting for me as the learning part. How do you think about that for yourself?
Yeah. So again, storytelling is something I'm working on developing, and it's very much active area of developing knowledge for me. But I think that if I want to get my ideas to a much wider audience, that storytelling is like a key aspect to that, and that's partly why I'm so interested in it.
Yeah.
Right now, I'm very much focused on like get all the good ideas that I can, explain them to my audience in a way that they find valuable, and then eventually I want to develop a really good skill of like weaving that into stories to make it widely appealing to like a much bigger audience. It's not as much like, people that are unusually reflective and unusually interested in ideas and so on. But I'm lucky that like my initial audience I built is a really idea seeking audience that loves it, likes to think. And so to them, I can communicate very directly. Like, here's a really cool idea I learned. Like, let me break it down for you. Let me give you, the 10 parts of it or whatever.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, Spencer, I feel like this is our third podcast in 2020. And
great.
I love it. I really, really appreciate how your mind works. And just you can really feel your commitment to truth and understanding how things work and then explaining that. So I'm happy you're there in the
Anytime.
world.
I love coming on. So thanks so much, Michael.
And you've mentioned some of your websites before, but could you just share a little bit where people can learn more about you and follow you?
Yeah. So as of like 2 weeks ago, I think we now have 57 free tools you can use on our website, clearthinking.org. So if you want to understand your values better, or you want to make better decisions, or you want to understand how cognitive biases work, so just go to clearthinking.org. If you want to learn about my work more broadly, go to sparkwave.tech. So it's .tech. You can follow me on Twitter. I'm SPENCR Greenberg. And then I'd love for you to check out my podcast, Clear Thinking with Spencer Greenberg, where Michael is actually episode number 1. I love the episode with him so much. I made it the first episode of the series, but I have basically fun intellectual conversations with brilliant guests. So
Awesome. I highly, highly recommend the podcast to everyone. And I look forward to having our fourth conversation sometime in 2021, Spencer.
I love that. Thanks. Talk to you soon.
Thanks for listening to The Michael Simmons Show. We'll see you again next time, and be sure to click subscribe to get future episodes. If you found value in today's episode, we would greatly appreciate a 5-star rating on your favorite podcast player.